On July 15, 1996, 30-year-old Cindy Paulson told her sister she was taking a day hike in Denali National Park to clear her head after a difficult divorce. 6 weeks later, hunters found her sewn inside the hide of a caribou, barely breathing, in a cave 40 miles from any marked trail. Between those two moments lay a darkness that would reshape everything anyone thought they knew about survival, about the wilderness, and about what human beings are capable of becoming when they disappear into places where no one can hear them scream. But this story doesn't begin with the crime. It begins with a woman who made one ordinary decision on an ordinary summer morning, the kind of choice that millions of people make without consequence, the choice to walk alone into the wild. Cindy Paulson had come to Alaska 3 months earlier, fleeing a marriage that had dissolved with the slow, grinding inevitability of ice breaking up in spring. She'd taken a job at a wilderness outfitter in Anchorage, selling gear to tourists who wanted to taste adventure without the commitment of actual danger. Her co-workers described her as competent, quiet, someone who knew her equipment and respected the land. She'd grown up hiking in Colorado, understood weather patterns, carried proper safety gear. She wasn't reckless. On the morning she disappeared, Cindy filled out a solo hiking permit for the Savage River Trail, a moderate 8-mile loop that park literature described as suitable for intermediate hikers with alpine experience. She planned to be back by evening. She told the ranger at the permit desk she was carrying food for 2 days just in case. She had a GPS unit, a satellite communicator, water purification tablets, and a detailed topographic map marked with alternate routes. She had done everything right. The Savage River area in mid-July is a landscape that seems designed to inspire confidence. Rolling tundra stretches between gentle mountains painted in 100 shades of green under a sky so wide it makes you feel insignificant and immortal at the same time. The trail is well-maintained, clearly marked. Denali's massive peak looms in the distance like a promise, white and eternal against the blue. It's the kind of place that makes you understand why people move to Alaska, why they trade comfort for the chance to walk through country that still remembers what the world looked like before humans decided to improve it. Cindy started hiking at 6 a.m. when the air was cool and the light had that thin, crystalline quality that only exists at high latitudes in summer. A park maintenance worker saw her at the trailhead, shouldering a red backpack, checking her map one final time. She wore khaki hiking pants, a blue fleece jacket, sturdy boots with gaiters to keep out the gravelly soil. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back under a cap. She moved with the efficient rhythm of someone who spent time outdoors regularly. She looked prepared, the worker would later tell investigators, had all the right gear, knew what she was doing. Just another experienced hiker heading out for the day. Nothing about her seemed unusual or concerning. The first 4 miles of the Savage River Trail follow the riverbank through relatively open country. Even in summer, the landscape retains an austere beauty that can feel both welcoming and remote. Caribou tracks crisscross the muddy sections near the water. Ground squirrels chatter from rocks. The air smells of wet earth, moss, and something indefinable that people who live in cities never learn to recognize. The scent of a place where human presence is temporary, tolerated rather than embraced. Cindy would have made good time on this section. She was in excellent physical condition, accustomed to elevation and distance. Her plan was to reach the trail's highest point by mid-morning, eat lunch overlooking the river valley, then circle back via the alternate route marked on her map. Total time, 8 to 10 hours, depending on how long she spent at the scenic overlooks. A reasonable itinerary for someone of her experience level. But somewhere between the marked trail and the world of normal human expectations, something went wrong. When Cindy failed to return by 9 p.m., the Park Service initiated standard missing hiker protocols. Her emergency contact, her sister in Colorado, hadn't heard from her. Her car remained in the trailhead parking area, doors locked, nothing disturbed. Inside her vehicle, investigators found a detailed itinerary written in careful handwriting, listing her planned route, emergency procedures, expected return time. Everything suggested a methodical person who understood wilderness safety. The first search began at dawn the following morning. Park rangers, accompanied by a helicopter and 2 search dogs, covered the official trail system within 12 hours. They found nothing. No dropped equipment, no signs of struggle, no indication that Cindy had ever deviated from the marked path. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the landscape. By the 3rd day, the search had expanded to include volunteer mountain rescue teams from Anchorage and Fairbanks. More helicopters arrived. The dogs were brought back, supplemented by additional teams. Searchers spread across thousands of acres of tundra, ravines, and boulder fields. They checked every creek crossing, every potential fall hazard, every place where someone might have slipped or become trapped or succumbed to sudden weather. They found caribou bones, abandoned equipment from previous hikers, empty food caches left by mountaineering expeditions. They did not find Cindy Paulson. The search coordinator, a veteran ranger named Michael Chen, had overseen dozens of missing person cases in 20 years with the Park Service. He understood the statistical realities. Most lost hikers are found within 72 hours, usually embarrassed but unharmed, having taken a wrong turn or been delayed by weather. After 72 hours, the odds shift dramatically. After a week, search and rescue becomes search and recovery. After 2 weeks, hope becomes a luxury that investigators can't afford. The Denali backcountry is unforgiving, Chen explained to Cindy's sister during one of their daily phone calls, but it's also thorough. When the land takes someone, it usually leaves evidence: torn clothing, dropped gear, some indication of what happened. We're not finding that here, which is puzzling. What Chen couldn't say to a grieving family member was that the absence of evidence suggested possibilities that no one wanted to consider. Animal predation typically left remains. Falls and exposure left bodies. Weather-related deaths left traces. The complete disappearance of an experienced hiker on a well-traveled trail pointed towards scenarios that search coordinators discussed only among themselves, in quiet conversations after the families had gone home. After 2 weeks, the official search was scaled back to periodic helicopter flights and volunteer ground teams. Cindy's case joined the grim catalog of people who had walked into the Alaskan wilderness and never walked out. Her name was added to missing person databases, her photograph distributed to remote communities and hunting guides throughout the region. But for practical purposes, the active investigation had ended. Cindy's sister, Patricia, flew up from Denver to collect her belongings and drive her car back to Colorado. She spent 3 days in Anchorage, meeting with investigators, reviewing search reports, trying to understand how someone could simply vanish from a marked trail in a national park. The answers she received were compassionate but unsatisfying. Alaska was vast. The wilderness was indifferent. Sometimes people disappeared, and the reasons why remained locked in places where humans couldn't follow. They did everything they could, Patricia would later recall. But I had the feeling, I can't explain it, that they were missing something. Not through carelessness, but because they were looking for the wrong thing. They were searching for an accident victim. I started to wonder if maybe they should have been searching for something else. Patricia's intuition would prove more accurate than anyone could have imagined. The search for Cindy Paulson had focused on the area surrounding the official trail system, extending outward in concentric circles based on how far a lost or injured hiker might reasonably travel. This methodology was sound, based on decades of successful rescues and the statistical analysis of thousands of missing person cases. But it assumed that Cindy had become lost through her own actions, that she had made a navigational error, suffered an accident, or been overcome by weather or medical emergency. It did not account for the possibility that she had been taken. 40 miles northeast of the Savage River Trail, in a section of wilderness so remote that it appeared on topographical maps as unnamed contour lines and elevation markers, a man named Thomas Wade had been living off the grid for over a decade. His presence in the area was known to local authorities. Alaska has thousands of people who choose to live beyond the reach of conventional society, but he was considered harmless, if eccentric. Game wardens occasionally encountered him during routine patrols. noted his compliance with hunting and trapping regulations, filed brief reports that described him as reclusive but not problematic. Wade was 47 years old, a former military mechanic who had received a medical discharge from the Army in 1983 after what his records described as a psychological adjustment disorder. He had moved to Alaska in 1985, initially working seasonal jobs in Anchorage and Fairbanks before gradually retreating deeper into the wilderness. By 1990, he had established a permanent camp in a series of natural caves overlooking an unnamed tributary of the Toklat River. The caves had been carved by water over millennia, creating a network of interconnected chambers that remained dry year-round and maintained relatively stable temperatures even during Alaska's brutal winters. Wade had modified the largest chamber into a crude but functional living space, installing a wood-burning stove, constructing simple furniture from salvaged materials, creating a shelter that was invisible from aircraft and accessible only by foot across several miles of trackless tundra. He survived by trapping, hunting, and foraging, supplemented by occasional trips to purchase supplies from remote communities. His lifestyle was austere but sustainable. Local residents who encountered him during his infrequent visits to civilization described him as quiet, polite, someone who kept to himself and paid his bills in cash. He didn't drink, didn't cause trouble, didn't seek out human company. He seemed to prefer the company of the wilderness, and the wilderness, for its part, seemed to tolerate him. But Thomas Wade carried within himself a poison that had been growing in isolation, fermenting in the silence of a place where no one could witness the gradual transformation of eccentricity into something darker. Wade had begun to develop what psychiatrists would later classify as a delusional system centered around the concept of preservation. In his increasingly distorted thinking, the modern world was destroying everything pure and natural, and he had been chosen to save selected individuals by removing them from civilization's corrupting influence. His journals, discovered after his arrest, revealed a worldview that mixed garbled philosophy, survivalist ideology, and profound mental illness into a framework that made perfect sense to him and no sense to anyone else. "People are dying inside their comfortable lives," he wrote in one entry dated 18 months before Cindy's disappearance. "They walk around like corpses, poisoned by cities and technology and the noise of modern life. They need to be preserved, kept safe from the corruption." The old ways understood this. The old ways knew how to honor what was sacred. Wade's concept of preservation had evolved over time. Initially, he had focused on objects, collecting artifacts from abandoned homesteads, preserving animal specimens through traditional taxidermy, creating what he considered a museum of authentic Alaska life. But as his isolation deepened and his mental state deteriorated, his fixation had shifted toward living subjects. He had begun to fantasize about rescuing people from their corrupted lives, bringing them to his cave system, keeping them safe from what he perceived as the degradation of modern existence. The fantasy had remained just that, fantasy, until July 15, 1996, when he encountered a lone hiker on a section of unmarked trail that ran parallel to but several miles distant from the official park boundaries. Wade had been checking his trap line, a network of snares and deadfalls he maintained year-round to supplement his diet with small game. The trap line extended across nearly 20 miles of wilderness, connecting his cave system to various hunting areas through paths that existed only in his memory and were invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. He traveled these routes regularly, moving through the landscape with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent years learning to walk without leaving traces. On the morning he encountered Cindy, Wade was returning to his caves carrying 2 Arctic ground squirrels and a ptarmigan he had taken from his snares. He had been walking for several hours following a game trail that wound through a valley adjacent to the more popular hiking areas. The trail was not marked on any official map, but it offered easier passage through otherwise difficult terrain, and Wade knew that experienced hikers sometimes used it as a shortcut when returning from longer expeditions. He saw her from a distance first, a figure in blue and khaki moving steadily along the trail, heading in the direction of his caves. Wade dropped to the ground immediately, using a stand of stunted spruce trees as concealment, and watched through binoculars as the hiker approached. It was a woman traveling alone carrying a substantial pack. She moved with confidence, checking her GPS unit periodically, stopping occasionally to drink water or adjust her gear. In Wade's increasingly disordered mind, her presence on his trail was not a coincidence. She had been sent. She was one of the people who needed to be preserved, rescued from the poisonous influence of civilization. The fact that she was alone, far from any marked trail, in country that few people ever saw, seemed to him like a sign that he had been chosen to save her. Wade shadowed her for over an hour, moving parallel to the trail, staying hidden in the broken terrain and scattered vegetation. He observed her rest stops, noted her equipment, assessed her physical capabilities. She was clearly an experienced hiker, but she was also alone and far from help. More importantly, she was moving directly toward his caves, as if she had been guided there by some force that understood what needed to happen. The attack, when it came, was swift and methodical. Wade had spent years trapping animals, and he understood the principles of ambush, patience, and overwhelming force. He waited until Cindy reached a narrow section of trail that passed between two large boulders, a natural bottleneck that limited her options for escape. Then he struck from behind, using a weighted club made from a caribou antler wrapped in leather. The blow to the back of Cindy's head dropped her instantly. Wade had calculated the force carefully, enough to incapacitate, not enough to kill. In his delusional system, killing would have defeated the purpose. Dead people couldn't be preserved in the way he intended. They needed to be alive, conscious, able to experience their salvation from the corrupted world they had been living in. Wade dragged Cindy's unconscious body off the trail and into a concealed position among the rocks. He worked quickly but methodically, securing her hands and feet with zip ties he had carried for years specifically for this purpose. He gagged her with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt, then covered her with a tarp to hide her from any aircraft that might pass overhead. Then he sat down to wait for darkness. While he waited, Wade went through Cindy's pack with the thoroughness of someone who understood the value of gear in wilderness conditions. He found her GPS unit, her satellite communicator, her emergency beacon. He disabled each device carefully, removing batteries, disconnecting wires, ensuring that none of them could be used to call for help or reveal her location. He kept some of her equipment, the high-quality camping gear, the food, the medical supplies, but he buried most of it along with anything that might identify her in a cache that would never be found. When darkness fell, Wade began the process of moving Cindy to his caves. She had regained consciousness by then, but remained groggy from the head injury. Wade had experience moving large game across difficult terrain, and he applied those same techniques to transporting a human being. He constructed a crude travois from her hiking poles and a tarp, loaded her onto it, and began the slow journey across 5 miles of trackless wilderness. The trip took most of the night. Wade moved carefully, avoiding areas where the travois might leave obvious marks, stopping frequently to rest and to check that his prisoner remained secure. Cindy drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, sometimes attempting to struggle against her restraints, sometimes lying still with the glazed look of someone trying to process an incomprehensible situation. By dawn, they had reached the cave system. Wade dragged her into the largest chamber, the space he had converted into his living quarters, and secured her to a ring bolt he had installed in the stone wall years earlier, originally intended for hanging meat during processing. Then he sat down across from her and began to explain what he considered to be her salvation. "You were lost," he told her when she had fully regained consciousness and was staring at him with eyes wide with terror. "Not just lost on the trail, lost in life. I've been watching people like you for years, people who come up here looking for something they can't name. You were searching for authenticity, for real life, for escape from the poison of civilization. I'm going to give that to you." Cindy's response was exactly what Wade had expected. Fear, confusion, demands to be released. threats about search parties and police investigations. He had prepared for this reaction. In his journals, he had written extensively about the initial resistance that preserved individuals would show, their inability to immediately understand the gift they were receiving. It would take time for her to appreciate what was happening to her. "The search will end," Wade explained patiently. "It always does. And then you'll understand that this is where you were meant to be. This is preservation. This is authentic life, stripped of all the artificial complications that were destroying you." Over the following days, Wade established the routine that would govern Cindy's captivity. He fed her twice a day, small portions of dried meat, preserved vegetables, and water. He allowed her to use a chemical toilet he had constructed in an adjacent chamber under supervision. He talked to her regularly, explaining his philosophy, describing the corrupted world she had been rescued from, detailing his plans for her preservation. And he began the process that, in his delusional system, represented the ultimate expression of his care for her well-being. Wade had been studying traditional preservation techniques for years, not just the smoking and drying of meat, but the more complex processes used by indigenous cultures to create permanent records of important events and people. He had taught himself the basics of tanning, of working with animal hides, of creating durable materials that could last for decades without deterioration. In his mind, these skills were sacred knowledge, connecting him to authentic ways of life that predated the modern world's corruption. His plan for Cindy involved the creation of what he considered a living preservation, encasing her in carefully prepared animal skins that would protect her from the outside world, while allowing her to experience the pure, authentic existence he believed she needed. The process would be gradual, he explained to her, taking place over several weeks as her body adjusted to its new state and her mind accepted the reality of her salvation. The first skin came from a caribou Wade had taken 3 months earlier and had been preparing specifically for this purpose. He had tanned it using traditional methods, brain tanning as he called it, that created leather both supple and durable. The hide was large enough to wrap around a human body, and Wade had spent weeks modifying it, creating openings and fastenings that would allow for what he considered proper preservation. Cindy's reaction to the first wrapping was violent and sustained. She fought against the restraints, screamed until her voice gave out, alternately pleaded and threatened and tried to reason with her captor. Wade had expected this response, had planned for it. He knew that the preservation process would be traumatic initially, but he also knew that trauma was temporary while preservation was eternal. The skin was sewn around her body using heavy thread made from sinew, creating a cocoon that left only her head exposed. Wade had designed the wrapping to immobilize her limbs while still allowing for basic bodily functions and the circulation necessary to keep her alive. In his understanding, this was not torture, it was protection. The skin would shield her from the harsh realities of the outside world, creating a controlled environment where she could experience pure existence without the distractions and corruptions of modern life. As days turned into weeks, the psychological effects of Cindy's captivity began to compound. The complete immobilization, the sensory deprivation, the isolation, and the constant presence of her delusional captor created a mental state that fluctuated between terror, despair, and a strange dissociative calm that worried Wade more than her initial resistance had. Sometimes she would spend hours staring at the cave ceiling without speaking, her eyes tracking patterns in the stone that only she could see. Other times she would begin conversations with people who weren't there, carrying on detailed discussions with her sister, her ex-husband, co-workers from her job in Anchorage. Wade interpreted these episodes as signs that the preservation process was working, that her mind was releasing its attachment to the corrupted outside world. But the physical effects were becoming more concerning. Despite Wade's efforts to provide adequate nutrition, Cindy was losing weight rapidly. The stress of captivity, combined with the restriction of movement imposed by the hide wrapping, was causing muscle atrophy and systemic weakness. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and she had developed sores where the hide rubbing against her body created pressure points that couldn't heal properly. Wade adjusted his preservation methods in response to these issues, loosening some of the stitching to improve circulation, changing her position more frequently, supplementing her diet with vitamins he had stored for his own use. But he refused to consider that the fundamental concept might be flawed. In his mind, these were temporary adjustments, fine-tuning of a process that would ultimately result in perfect preservation. As August turned to September and September approached October, Wade began to prepare additional skins. His original plan had involved a series of wrappings, each one more complete than the last, that would gradually transform Cindy from a victim of modern civilization into a perfectly preserved specimen of authentic human existence. The caribou hide was only the beginning. He had been preparing the pelts of wolves, bears, and smaller animals, each one intended to add layers of protection and authenticity to the preservation process. But the physical reality of keeping a human being alive under these conditions was proving more difficult than Wade had anticipated. Cindy's body was failing in ways that his experience with animal preservation hadn't prepared him for. Animals, once dead, didn't require ongoing care. Humans, kept alive but immobilized, needed constant attention to prevent the kind of systemic breakdown that seemed to be occurring despite his efforts. Wade's journals from this period show increasing frustration with what he perceived as the inadequacy of modern humans for proper preservation. "She lacks the physical resilience of people who lived authentic lives," he wrote. "Generations of soft living have weakened her beyond what the old techniques can easily accommodate. The process requires adjustments that the ancestors never needed to make." But Wade was committed to his vision, and he was willing to adapt his methods to achieve what he considered the higher goal of perfect preservation. As October arrived, and the first snows began to dust the peaks surrounding his cave system, he began work on what he planned to be the final stage of Cindy's transformation, a complete cocoon that would preserve her permanently, creating a living monument to the authentic life he believed she had been seeking when he first encountered her on the trail. He never completed that work. On October 28th, 45 days after Cindy Paulson had disappeared from the Savage River Trail, 3 hunters working their way through the remote wilderness northeast of the park encountered something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The hunters, Jake Morrison, a local guide, and 2 clients from the lower 48, were tracking a wounded moose through country they had never explored before. The animal had been hit during a hunt the previous day but had escaped, and Morrison was determined to find it rather than leave it to suffer and die slowly. The track led them through increasingly difficult terrain, over ridges and through valleys that appeared on no recreational maps, into the kind of wilderness that most people never see. Morrison had been hunting and guiding in Alaska for 20 years. He knew the country as well as anyone, understood the subtle signs that indicated human presence in areas where humans rarely traveled. When he noticed the faint but persistent smell of wood smoke in a valley where no smoke should exist, he altered their course to investigate. They found Wade's caves by following the smoke to its source, a nearly invisible chimney that vented through a crack in the rocks 50 feet above the main chamber. The opening to the cave system was concealed behind brush and fallen stones, camouflaged so effectively that they would have passed within 20 feet without seeing it if not for the telltale signs of regular human use. Worn spots in the vegetation, a faint path, the smell of cooking food mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. Morrison approached the cave opening with the caution of someone who understood that hermits living this far from civilization were often armed and always unpredictable. He called out, identifying himself and his companions, explaining that they were tracking wounded game and asking permission to pass through the area. The response that came from inside the cave was not what he expected. It was a woman's voice, weak but unmistakably human, calling for help. Morrison signaled for his companions to stay back and moved closer to the cave entrance. The voice came again, clearer this time, speaking words that made no immediate sense. "Please, if someone's there, I'm Cindy Paulson. I've been missing since July. He's got me wrapped in skins. I can't move. Please help me." The name meant nothing to Morrison. The search for Cindy Paulson had been concentrated in an area 40 miles to the southwest. and news of her disappearance had not reached the remote communities where Morrison lived and worked. But the desperation in the voice and the bizarre reference to being wrapped in skins was enough to convince him that something was seriously wrong. Morrison entered the cave with his rifle ready, not knowing what he might encounter but understanding that the situation had moved beyond anything resembling normal wilderness experience. The main chamber was larger than he had expected, clearly modified for human habitation, furnished with rough furniture and lit by several kerosene lamps. The smell he had noticed outside was stronger here: wood smoke, unwashed human bodies, and underneath it all, the sweet, sick odor of infection. In the far corner of the chamber, secured to the stone wall by a length of chain, was what initially looked like a large bundle of animal hides. Only when Morrison moved closer did he realize that the bundle had a human face, pale, emaciated, barely recognizable as female, but undeniably alive and conscious. "Are you Cindy Paulson?" Morrison asked. Though the question felt surreal under the circumstances, the woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I've been here since July," she whispered. "He wrapped me in these skins. He says he's preserving me. I can't feel my legs anymore." Morrison had seen a lot of things in 20 years of wilderness living, but nothing had prepared him for this. The woman was sewn into what appeared to be caribou hide, with additional layers of fur and leather wrapped around the original casing. Only her head was free, and her arms were bound so tightly against her body that circulation had clearly been compromised for an extended period. The skins were stained with bodily fluids and showed signs of infection where they pressed against her body. "Where is he?" Morrison asked, looking around the chamber for any sign of the person responsible for this horror. "He left yesterday morning to check his traps," Cindy replied. "He should be back soon. He always comes back." Morrison quickly assessed the situation. The woman needed immediate medical attention, but she was 40 miles from the nearest road and secured in a way that would require cutting tools to free her. His satellite phone showed no signal from inside the cave, and even if he could reach emergency services, it would take hours or days for a rescue team to reach this location. He called to his companions, who had remained outside, and quickly explained the situation. One of the hunters was a paramedic from Anchorage, and Morrison sent him immediately to examine the woman while he and the other hunter secured the cave entrance and prepared for the possibility that her captor might return. The paramedic's assessment was grim. The woman was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and showing signs of systemic infection from pressure sores that had developed where the hide wrapping restricted circulation. Her pulse was weak and irregular, her breathing shallow, her body temperature dangerously low. She had lost an estimated 30 to 40 pounds from her normal body weight, and muscle atrophy was so severe that it was unclear whether she would be able to walk even if freed from the restraints. "We need to get her out of here immediately," the paramedic told Morrison, "but moving her in this condition across this terrain could kill her, and I don't have the tools to cut through these bindings safely. Some of the stitching has grown into your skin where infection developed." Morrison faced a decision that would require weighing immediate risks against long-term survival. They could attempt to carry Cindy out of the wilderness in her current condition, a journey that might take 2 days across difficult terrain and would almost certainly prove fatal given her weakened state. Or they could remain in the cave, try to treat her condition with the limited medical supplies they carried, and hope that her captor didn't return before help could arrive. Morrison chose a third option. He sent one of the hunters back towards civilization with instructions to reach the nearest phone and call for emergency helicopter evacuation. The man would travel light, moving as fast as possible across country he knew well, and could reach help within 12 to 15 hours if conditions remained favorable. Meanwhile, Morrison and the paramedic would remain with Cindy, working to stabilize her condition and preparing for whatever confrontation might occur if Thomas Wade returned to his caves. The paramedic began the delicate process of cutting away portions of the hide wrapping to relieve pressure on Cindy's circulation and to clean the infected areas where her skin had been damaged by prolonged contact with the animal skins. The work was slow and painful. The hides had been sewn with tremendous care, and in many places the thread had worked its way into wounds that had healed around it. Removing the bindings without causing additional damage required tools and expertise that weren't available in the cave. As the paramedic worked, Cindy began to tell them what had happened to her over the past 6 weeks. Her story emerged in fragments, interrupted by pain, and the psychological difficulty of reliving experiences that had pushed her beyond the normal boundaries of human endurance. But gradually, Morrison and the paramedic began to understand the magnitude of what she had survived. Wade had kept her immobilized for the entire period of her captivity, allowing her out of the hide wrapping only for brief periods when he adjusted the bindings or added new layers of preservation material. He had fed her minimal amounts of food, just enough to keep her alive, and had provided water irregularly, sometimes withholding it for days when he believed she was showing insufficient gratitude for her preservation. He had talked to her constantly, explaining his philosophy, describing the corrupt world he had rescued her from, detailing his plans for her ultimate transformation into what he considered a perfect specimen of authentic human existence. The psychological torture had been as systematic as the physical abuse. Wade had told her repeatedly that no one was searching for her, that her family had given up hope, that the outside world had forgotten her existence. He described in detail how search efforts had been called off, how her disappearance had become just another statistic, how her former life was continuing without her as if she had never existed. Whether these claims were true or false, they had achieved their intended effect of destroying her hope of rescue and forcing her to depend entirely on her captor for survival. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Wade's genuine belief that he was helping her. His interactions with Cindy showed no sadistic pleasure in her suffering, no sexual motivation, no apparent understanding that he was causing harm. In his deeply disordered mind, he was performing an act of salvation, rescuing her from a corrupted existence and providing her with the authentic life he believed she needed. The horror of her situation was compounded by his complete conviction that he was acting from benevolent motives. As night fell in the cave, Morrison and the paramedic worked by lamplight to keep Cindy alive while waiting for help to arrive, and hoping that Thomas Wade would not return before rescue became possible. Outside, the first winter storm of the season was beginning to build, with snow starting to fall and wind beginning to howl through the rocks surrounding the cave system. The weather would make helicopter evacuation more difficult, but it might also delay Wade's return from his trapping expedition. Morrison had positioned himself near the cave entrance with his rifle, watching the narrow path that provided the only approach to the chamber where they had found Cindy. He had hunted dangerous game throughout Alaska and understood the principles of creating defensive positions in wilderness conditions, but he had never faced the possibility of shooting another human being, and he hoped that Wade's return could be avoided or managed without violence. The paramedic continued working on Cindy's bindings, making slow progress in freeing her from the hide wrapping that had been her prison for 6 weeks. Each layer removed revealed new evidence of what she had endured: pressure sores that had become infected, circulation damage that might prove permanent, muscle atrophy so severe that her legs looked like those of a concentration camp survivor. But she remained conscious, alert, and determined to survive long enough to see the outside world again. "I never gave up hope," she told them, as the paramedic worked to clean infected wounds on her arms. "Even when he told me no one was looking anymore, even when I started to believe him, I never stopped thinking about getting out. I knew that someday, somehow, someone would find this place. I just had to stay alive long enough." As the storm intensified outside, Morrison began to worry about their ability to evacuate Cindy even if the helicopter reached the area. The wind was making flying dangerous, and snow was beginning to accumulate in ways that would make landing difficult. They might be trapped in the cave for days, forced to care for a dying woman with inadequate supplies while waiting for weather conditions to improve. But they were committed now to seeing the situation through to whatever conclusion awaited them. Cindy Paulson had survived 6 weeks of unimaginable horror, and they were not going to let her die in the final hours before rescue became possible. Whatever happened next, whether Wade returned, whether the weather made evacuation impossible, whether Cindy's condition deteriorated beyond their ability to help, they would stay with her until the end. The cave fell quiet except for the sound of wind outside and the careful, methodical work of cutting away the bindings that had held Cindy prisoner for 6 weeks. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the cave entrance, the Alaskan wilderness waited with its infinite capacity for both beauty and horror, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to human hope, vast and patient as the storm that was building in the mountains all around them.